Good evening. Tonight we open with something more aromatic and far more ancient than any headline it attracts. Marijuana, a plant that has comforted, shocked, and reshaped human lives for thousands of years. Put aside the cliched stoner humor and the polished dispensary marketing. Its real history snakes through smoke-filled shrines, dusty apothecaries, ocean crossings, and courthouse steps. At times a remedy, at times a perceived threat. The reality is that you would struggle even a single day trying to truly trace its past. Place yourself in the wrong century or under the wrong legal code, and what once healed could just as easily condemn. If this sort of deep dive speaks to you, tap like and subscribe. Down in the comments, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I never tire of seeing how scattered and yet connected this audience is. Silence your notifications, draw in one slower breath, and let's start. The organism we now call cannabis began, as so many ancient things did, simply as a wind-carried kernel on the steppe, a tall, modest stalk emerging from lean earth beneath an enormous sky. It knew nothing yet of our names, statutes, or sermons. There was only this: it grew where other crops sometimes failed. Its stalks could be teased into rope, its seeds eaten or crushed into oil, its blossoms left to wither and dry. Faint traces in clay impressions, in fragments of cord, in burnt seeds from hearths, and in the naked genetics preserved in living leaves gradually direct us toward an origin story that is not heroic myth, but slow, wandering adaptation. Hemp moved like a quiet partner beside the earliest settled peoples of Eurasia, showing up in Neolithic Chinese sites and in the buried caches of Bronze Age steppe cultures. Tamed not in one dazzling moment, but stepwise, shaped by human selection first for fiber, then for seed, and where climate, trade, and appetite encouraged it, for sticky strength of resin. In those first centuries, the choices that altered a species were tiny, utilitarian ones. Straight, towering stalks were favored by the rope maker who wanted lines that would not twist on themselves. Low, branching, resin-heavy plants were kept by a healer searching for a stronger salve. Over many generations, those quiet preferences carved patterns into the plant's DNA, gradually giving rise to the forms we later distinguished as hemp, bred for fiber and food, and the drug varieties carrying the intoxicating resins treasured elsewhere. If you listen to the strata of soil, the plant's first haunts speak softly. In the loose loess of northern China, in the Yellow River Basin, archaeologists have uncovered fibers and seeds stretching back roughly 6 millennia, within cultures such as Yangshao and Hemudu, where hemp sits among the tools of Stone Age farmers, already turning kindling and stems into cloth and rope. Farther west along the steppe, in graves sunk into permafrost, the Pazyryk people of the Altai who slept under felt-adorned wood and inked their skin with tattoos, left behind signs of another kind of relationship with this plant. Not only stalks for cordage, but residues on braziers and inside vessels. Residues that, under modern microscopes, smell of smoke, ritual, and altered states. The Tarim Basin, that long, dry corridor along a proto-Silk Road, yielded the Yanghai tomb in the early 2000s, when a looter's narrow shaft into a mound was widened by archaeologists who uncovered what was essentially a complete cache of dried cannabis. The plant preserved in that burial dated to around the first millennium. BCE, roughly 25 centuries back, appeared strikingly rich in the very molecules that tug at consciousness, implying deliberate breeding not just for rope or seed, but for something more. Victor and his collaborators wrote about the find with the delighted precision of scholars who have caught an old acquaintance in an unexpected act. Their careful analyses suggested that communities in that region were cultivating cannabis specifically for ritual inhalation. And long before such tombs were ever catalogued by modern scholars, Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described Scythian tents filling with hemp smoke, men shouting as if the tops of their skulls were being pried apart. He watched steam and smoke swirl and left with the understanding that in foreign lands, smoke itself could be a cleansing holy medium. In the language of botany, later centuries folded the plant formally into the order Lamiales. Linnaeus in 1753 entrusted it to the printed page as Cannabis sativa, tidy and exact, in the first edition of Species Plantarum. A few decades later, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, examining specimens from the East, working at the Jardin des Plantes, proposed cannabis indica for the shorter, denser, resin-loaded plants of the Indian subcontinent. Through the 19th and 20th centuries, botanists suggested ruderalis and toyed with subspecies. Into that neat taxonomic framework poured a chaotic human history of migrations and selective breeding. Modern genomic work, the quiet digital excavation of DNA in the 21st century, has confirmed what cultivators and herders sensed long ago. There are at least two broad genetic lineages. One cluster was refined for extended bast fibers and abundant seed, often the tall, stately plants waving in temperate fields. Another cluster was shaped toward compact, resin-crowded flowers in mountain valleys and warm hillsides where people valued smokable buds, or the sticky exudate later scraped and pressed into hashish. The data do not present a single clean evolutionary tree, but rather a plaited stream, gene flow crisscrossing populations, several possible centers of domestication, or at the very least, distinct centers of use and human culture, steering plant evolution as steadily as seasonal light and rain ever did. The purposes early people found for cannabis were as diverse as the terrains they walked. Fiber seems to have come first, and nearly everywhere. Lines and nets, rigging and tent lashings, stirrup straps and harness, all the things needed when societies began to travel farther and trust themselves to water. Hemp fibers quite literally bound some empires, serving as rigging on Roman-oared ships, then on Viking longboats, then on Chinese junks. In China, hemp slipped into the origin story of paper itself. While tradition credits Kai Lun in the 2nd century CE with the invention of paper, the fibers that underlay that innovation were frequently tattered linen and hemp. The vegetable ghost of a hardy stalk was woven into the earliest bureaucratic records and first fragile pages of verse. Seed and oil were more than raw materials for tools. They were sustenance and light. Pressed oil fed kitchen fires and filled lamps that watched through winter darkness. Seeds were toasted for a rich, nut-like flavor, ground into porridges, or tossed into stews where every calorie counted and each new taste was a small delight. Wherever conditions permitted, flowers were dried and turned toward medicine, made into balms, poured into bathwater, packed onto wounds. It is revealing that humanity's first recorded attention to the plant is thoroughly practical. Rope that tethers a horse, seed that warms a stomach. Yet alongside that steady thread of usefulness, something else twined. Resinous blossoms, dark and adhesive. A baffling chemistry that awoke when brought near flame. That resin would eventually redirect the plant's social destiny. In arid valleys and sun-baked slopes, from the Hindu Kush to the Caucasus to the carved terraces of the Himalayas, growers began favoring plants voluptuous with blossoms and heavy with trichomes. Their tiny glands swollen with terpenes and cannabinoids, compounds whose names chemists would patiently coin long after the first cultivator's bones had returned to dust. The neat modern split between industrial hemp and drug cannabis is as much a human invention as a botanical one, and it arises from that long arithmetic of wants. Rigging and sailcloth demanded in one place, trance, euphoria, and ceremony desired in another. From those separate selections came the twin visages of cannabis that later ages would recognize. That recognition spread along the same routes that stitched the old world together: commerce, conquest, pilgrimage, and migration. The Silk Road was never just a passageway for lustrous thread. It ferried seed and variety, rope and recipe, scented fumes and a handful of names that would be reshaped on foreign tongues. In Sanskrit, the plant appears as banga or ma. In Chinese, ma. In Greek, cannabis. In Arabic, hashish. Each word is a small incision in language, cutting a space for the plant. Those words traveled with caravans and with scholars who read far-off treatises, whose libraries doubled as pharmacies, and whose formulas for salves and potions formed the scaffolding of early pharmacology. Those formulas, noted in medical compendia and temple scrolls where they were carefully stored, open the next, more intimate chamber of this history. Medicine is slow to write, and those who inscribe it are often slower still. Working through parable, trial and error, direct observation, and the awkward translation of one dead tongue into another. In China, the law that gathered around cannabis is as ancient as the healing tradition itself. The semi-legendary figure towering here, half deity, half cultural ancestor, is Shennong, the divine farmer, who in myth sampled hundreds of herbs and recorded their influences on the body. Ascribed to him is a herbal classic, later collected as the Shennong Bencao Jing, a work whose surviving form dates to the early Common Era, but which claims to echo knowledge from times beyond firm historical memory. In its taxonomy, cannabis appears as a respected plant, its seeds enumerated as nourishing, its flowering tops acknowledged as medicinal. Centuries later, the authoritative pharmacopoeias of Imperial China, most famously Li Shizhen's monumental Bencao Gangmu in the Ming dynasty, approached cannabis with encyclopedic reserve, documenting uses for constipation, as a mild diuretic, and as a component in poultices rubbed onto swollen joints. Southward, on the Indian subcontinent, the plant's tale is woven straight into the fabric of sacred verse and household practice. The Vedas, among the oldest preserved compositions in the Indo-European family, list panga among other plants, and the Atharva Veda in particular treats it with an uneasy reverence. Praised as an herb that chases away fear, it is also grouped among healing agents that cool suffering. In the vast treatises of Ayurveda, the Karaka Samhita and the Sushruta Samhita layered texts, continuously edited from the first millennium BCE through the early Common Era. Cannabis is classified as therapeutic when administered with care, a helper in easing pain, a spur or calmer of digestion depending on preparation, a component in herbal pastes and in anesthetic mixtures used during surgical operations. Sushruta, the surgeon whose aphoristic lines on incision, cautery and suturing read like grim, intimate poetry, mentions substances employed to dull agony and render cuts survivable. In such lists, cannabis appears not as a blunt standalone remedy, but as one ingredient among many a supporting actor in a larger botanical cast. Egypt's famed medical papyri, especially the Ebers papyrus dated to around 1550 BCE, speak in recipes that weave together incantation and experiment. Among frankincense and other scented resins, some scholars detect references that may point to cannabis in prescriptions for inflamed eyes, swollen tissues, or childbirth pains. Direct proof is fragmentary and contested, hinging on philology and plant identification. Yet the broader pattern is unmistakable. Wherever complex societies arose, they compiled plant-based remedies that numbed ache, quelled fevers, stemmed bleeding, or loosened the body for labor, and they recopied those recipes so they could cross time and, whenever trade or conquest permitted, cross borders. The Greeks and Romans cast their own light across this plant. Herodotus, that roaming observer of the 5th century BCE, delighted in recording other people's customs, whether he understood them or not. In one account of the Scythians, he describes them throwing hemp seeds onto hot stones inside felt tents, inhaling the aromatic fumes until throats and eyes opened to some sharpened awareness. Later, medical writers folded such travel tales into structured systems. Dioscorides, a Greek physician who served the Roman army in the 1st century CE, included cannabis in De Materia Medica, describing it as useful for ear pain, especially the root juice dropped into the ear, and as a salve base for easing discomfort and removing corns. Pliny the Elder, in his encyclopedic Natural History of the same century, noted hemp's diverse utilities, the resilience of its fibers, the nourishment from its seeds, and its medicinal employment as recorded in his era. Galen, the influential 2nd century architect of humoral medicine, placed plant-derived analgesics and topical applications among the tools physicians reached for to handle swellings and chronic pains. Their thinking was thoroughly practical. What soothes? What reduces inflammation? Answers came through practice, passing from field to infirmary to writing tablet. Where Roman roads and Greek script could not carry this knowledge, translators did, especially in the cosmopolitan heartlands of a new empire of faith. The translation endeavors of the Abbasid caliphs in 9th century Baghdad rendered Greek pharmacopoeias freshly alive in Arabic. Physicians such as Al-Raza, known in the Latin world as Razes, and Ibn Sina Avicenna carried that synthesis forward between the late 9th and early 11th centuries. Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, later a cornerstone of European medical education after its Latin translation, lists cannabis among the drugs that can be used to treat pain and swelling. Doctors in Cordoba, Cairo, and Baghdad prepared cannabis-based remedies in their practices. Ibn al-Baitar, the 13th century Andalusian botanist and pharmacologist, compiled a huge manual of simple medicaments cataloguing plants across the Islamic world. His entries attest to a shared Mediterranean and North African familiarity with cannabis, where apothecaries composed tinctures and oils, metering doses with the caution of craftsmen who understood how swiftly a healing herb could turn mischievous. The trail of names itself shows how this body of knowledge traversed continents. Sanskrit, Chinese, Greek, Latin, Arabic, and with each script shift, pharmacology shifted as well. The hard-earned know-how of how much to give, when and to whom translated slowly but persistently across borders. Preparations were numerous. Poultices of crushed leaves were laid against swollen joints. Rich ointments infused with plant oils were spread across cracked or inflamed skin. Decoctions and infusions were brewed for childbirth pains or digestive distress. Vapors and steam baths were used to ease tight chests. And in some traditions, more daring preparations served as crude anesthetics for grievous wounds or surgical procedures. These were seldom one-herb cures. They were complex mixtures designed to balance humors and temperaments, much as a Greek physician would seek to counter heat with cold or dryness with moisture. Scale also mattered. The village apothecary crafting a tiny jar for a local official or temple healer needed consistency. That, in turn, required familiarity with plant strains, awareness of seasonal and soil variations in potency, and an eye for storage and transport conditions. It was a craft straddling alchemy and accounting. If medicine drew the plant down into measured, dosed use, religion and ritual raised it toward the invisible. Smoke has a peculiar ability to invite the sacred. The way it curls and thickens, then thins and disappears, wrapping a gathering in a temporary cocoon of altered perception. High up among the Pazyryk and Scythian peoples, archaeologist Sergei Rudenko in the 1920s turned up artifacts that, analyzed with modern chemical tools, point strongly to ceremonial burning. Wooden braziers and stone bowls retained residues that hinted of charred plant matter and something more than kitchen smoke. Herodotus's hemp-filled tents found physical parallels in such finds, where seeds and burnt fragments align eerily with his descriptions of steamy rites. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. A nomad's tent glowing softly by lamplight, men pressing damp seeds onto heated stones until thin, papery vapors bloom like incense. Laughter follows, then the solemn untying of ordinary rules. Status, rank, and restraint loosen for a while. This is not mere diversion, it is technique, a crafted way of crossing thresholds. Across the Iranian plateau and into India, the ritual narrative becomes denser and more contested. The Indo-Iranian sacred drink haoma in the Avesta, soma in the Vedas, holds a nearly legendary place in the study of religions. Pressed from a plant and consumed as an offering, it was described as granting clarity, vigor, or ecstasy. What species exactly served as soma or haoma is still argued over. Some scholars point to cannabis as an appealing candidate, given its presence in Indian texts and its later devotional uses. Medieval sources occasionally link banga with divine intoxication. Others argue for ephedra, for the fly agaric mushroom, or for some now-lost botanical combination. The fierce debate is helpful because it reminds us that the technology of worship and the reality of plant biology rarely align perfectly over centuries. the sacramental species may shift as communities migrate, trade, or lose access. Mixtures may replace single herbs. What is clear is that by the medieval era, cannabis in India had solidified as an explicitly devotional substance. It was offered to Shiva, consumed in sweetened milk as bhang during festivals to fracture the self into revelry, and smoked as ganja in small clay pipes by sadhus seeking transcendence and detachment from worldly worry. These were not private indulgences, but communal rites. Powder or paste was passed from hand to hand, a tiny, potent sacrament held in the bright crush of celebration. Within Islamic lands, the plant's narrative twists around theological tension and mystical experimentation. Foundational Islamic texts forbid wine, though they do not treat every intoxicant identically. Cannabis entered these regions doubly as a medicinal herb and, from the later medieval centuries onward, as hashish, a concentrated resin that Arabic authors name and discuss openly. Certain Sufi circles, the ecstatic, rule-bending edges of Islamic mysticism, at times adopted hashish as another path to altered states, typically pursued through chanting, music, or dance. Medieval polemicists did not miss the association. The term hashishiyah hardened into an insult in some contexts, shorthand for deviant zeal. The Nizari Ismailis of Alamut labeled hashashan by foes slipped into legend through lurid accusations that they dosed followers with hashish to breed fearless assassins, a story Marco Polo helped broadcast centuries later. Modern historians largely doubt the literal truth, but recognize the narrative's rhetorical power. Enemies weaponized the specter of drug-induced fanaticism to frame a political challenge. For Sufis themselves, the story was knottier. Some condemned hashish outright, others used it sparingly or situationally. For many, the preferred road to union with God remained the long, disciplined unfolding of remembrance and ecstatic practice, rather than any chemical shortcut. Islamic legal scholars, the muftis and fuqaha, took diverging stances, sometimes allowing therapeutic use while prohibiting leisure intoxication, sometimes forbidding all inebriants regardless of context. This debate reflects a broader insight. A plant can be revered sacrament in one bowl and social menace in another, depending entirely on who pours and why. Ritual settings were as varied as their people. In Central Asia's steppe shrines and rough temples, preparation was stark and direct. Smoke readied fighters for battle or priests for augury. In the Fertile Crescent and North African towns, cannabis filtered into coffee houses and cramped dwellings, serving simultaneously as relaxation and devotional aid. Ibn Battuta, the 14th century traveler, noted hashish along his routes and watched it appear in gatherings where jokes and sadness walked side by side. In India and Nepal, bhang turned into a ritual of welcome and celebration. Sadhus drew on pipes of ganja and spoke of dissolving into the divine fabric of things. Every culture that embraced the plant wrapped its own symbols tightly around it. In some, it signified fecundity and life. In others, a vehicle by which one might step briefly into the realm of ancestors, where healers and seers conversed with spirits. The imagery is consistently contradictory. Intoxication is both trespass and permission. Within ritual boundaries, it is sanctioned because the rite tames it. Beyond those boundaries, it can be condemned as unruly. This double nature turns cannabis into a tool for working edges, for softening the boundary between self and others, between the living and the dead, between pain and ease. It opens limited windows where an alternative social order can emerge for an evening. Priests, shamans, and ritual specialists long understood that its capacity to loosen ordinary perception was an implement. Like any implement, it could wound or mend, initiate or dissolve. And as in medicine, scale and preparation in ritual life were concrete concerns. Temples maintained orchards or modest garden plots. Attendants tended plants according to ritual calendars. Resin was painstakingly collected by hand-rubbing flowers, a slow labor that yielded charas in Kashmir's hills, where the ability to produce a uniform, glossy, dark resin became a point of pride and artistry. Bhang preparations, by contrast, belonged to the household sphere. Leaves and small flowers plucked and bruised, soaked in water or milk, then simmered with sweeteners, spices, and sometimes nuts, until they became a thick drink shared from cup to cup. Very little in such ritual use was truly impulsive. Even the wildest-seeming ceremonies were structured by rules. The auspicious hour, the portion each participant received, the phrases intoned. No rite becomes sacred by accident. The steady material effort of cultivation, refinement, and dosing animated the plant in social life, lifting an herb into a sacrament handed down across generations. And always it showed that dual face, the same stems that weaved into garments, the same seeds that filled bowls, the same oil that lit clay lamps, were also present in salves for pain, in curls of smoke during prayers, in resins pressed for shared ecstasy. That doubleness explains why even the earliest written records bristle with argument. Those who relied on rope, sailcloth, and sack fabric treated the plant as economic backbone. Those who sought physical ease embraced it as medicine. Those who wished to peer beyond the visible world raised it to the status of holy companion. From the river plains of China to the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush to the shaded storage rooms of Mediterranean ports, the plant adapted. Humans layered their needs onto its form, and those same needs sent shoots back into its evolution. Collect all these strands, the taming of tall stalks for bast fiber, the incremental selection of resinous blossoms on warm hillsides, the precise formulations of healers writing in Sanskrit, Greek, Arabic, and Chinese, and the smoky communal rites unfolding in tents and shrines, and a map emerges. It is a map of human creativity and uncertainty. Cannabis is not just a botanical entity with a list of chemical traits. It is a surface onto which societies projected their desires to bind and illuminate, to dull and reveal, to mend and to approach divinity. Archaeological remnants lend texture, texts lend intention, and rituals lend spirit. Together, they form a human history at once utilitarian and sacred, knotted with caravans and with prayers, veering between agronomy and lyric. A storyteller might be tempted to wrap this early chapter with a tidy lesson, that in cultivating plants we cultivate ourselves, and that plants in turn cultivate our habits. But history resists such clean moralizing. Instead, hold this thought. The first people who twisted hemp into cord or dropped handfuls of seed into boiling pots could not imagine the legal hair-splitting of later empires, nor the self-righteous disdain of distant moral crusaders, nor the chemist's vials in which its essence would sit labeled in Latin. What they recognized was immediate: a strong fiber, a satisfying seed, a mysterious fragrance that briefly rearranged perception. That blend of practical necessity and spiritual curiosity planted the beginnings of a narrative that would stretch across continents and epochs. The plant itself, unhurried as always, followed the climates and the human hands that carried it, sometimes quietly as rigging hidden high in the shrouds of a ship, sometimes dramatically as curling incense in a tent where people sought audiences with unseen powers. In both guises, it became essential to everyday chores and to extraordinary rites. So the tale winds onward. Leaves and flowers travel through clinics and sanctuaries, through scribal workshops and translation houses, across borders and dynasties, with each movement measured in braided rope and in smoke rising toward rafters. The ancients scratched recipes in clay and ink. Pilgrims tucked dried sprigs into satchels. Potters pressed hemp cord against wet clay, leaving ghostly imprints on fired vessels. Priests ignited its smoke to enter a threshold space where normal and holy traded roles. In those exchanges, the plant counted as both item of trade and intimate ally. The tally of that relationship scattered in tombs, set down in treatises, hinted at in liturgy, now serves as the faint lantern we hold up to read this past. The flame flickers and shadows lengthen, and once more it becomes clear, with the hazy assurance of drifting into sleep, that cannabis's earliest story is one of unassuming practicality laced with occasional sanctity, a plant coaxed into new forms by simple vectors, need, wonder, and devotion. Hemp then sat at the center of pre-industrial economies for centuries, its rough fibers spun into rope, sailcloth, fabrics, and paper that quite literally held seafaring states together. Imagine a line of sailing ships in the era before steam, hulls dark with pitch, masts rising like a man-made forest, rigging bristling in every direction. Every cord and halyard is hemp. Every canvas spread above is woven from its threads. The Spanish Armada of 1588, the Dutch fleets that fueled the Republic's 17th century trade, the squadrons launched under Tudor and Stuart monarchs, and later the imposing armadas of the British Royal Navy, all devoured hemp in staggering quantities. Whole districts in northern Europe, Estonia, Livonia, the ports of Riga and Reval, the wooded banks along the Baltic and White Seas, became known across the continent as hemp country. Hanseatic merchants moved bales from those coasts to Bruges and Lübeck. Amsterdam's 17th century warehouses swelled with hemp, destined to be laid into ropes for Dutch East India Company vessels bound for Batavia and beyond. Imperial ambitions could almost be measured in fathoms of cordage. Stand long enough in a 17th or 18th century dockyard Portsmouth, Chatham, Deptford on the Thames, and the rhythm of it seeps in. Rope walks stretch out like enclosed streets along the river where teams of workers pace back and forth, twisting fibers into yarns, yarns into rope, each length cut to precise dimensions. A single warship demanded miles upon miles of rigging. Massive cables to anchor ships and brace masts required still more. Sailcloth, known as duck from the Dutch doek, was woven from hemp or flax into a dense fabric, stout enough to catch the wind and tough enough to endure salt spray and harsh sun. Oakum, the untwisted shreds of spent rope used to caulk seams, was another way in which hemp lived a second life. Picked apart by hand, soaked in tar, and pounded back between planks with caulking irons and mallets, it sealed vessels against the sea. The air in those yards carried the heavy amalgam of tar, salt, sweat, and powdered hemp. The soundscape was the slow creak of winches and the unending murmur of laborers whose hands, quietly and repetitively, kept the global shipping system from coming apart. Governments took note. Naval power could not be assembled on a whim. Louis XIV's minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, in 17th century France, imposed order on shipbuilding and supply lines, reaching into forests for timber and into fields for flax and hemp. Mercantilist policy extended all the way down to the fiber crops needed by the king's fleet. In England, a series of monarchs and parliaments behaved similarly. Royal dockyards and private contractors alike needed a constant stream of raw fibers, and when markets lagged, the state tried to nudge or push cultivation. In the Dutch Republic, the Dutch East India Company's voracious requirements gave hemp politics of its own. Baltic supply became a matter of national concern. Nowhere, perhaps, did the transformation run as deep as in Russia. Peter the Great, ruling from 1682 to 1725, created a navy and an associated shipbuilding industry almost out of nothing, using his freshly built city of St. Petersburg as a base. He inspected yards personally, decreed hemp cultivation, and reordered provincial economies to furnish naval stores. Thus, the logistics of empire sprouted not only in arsenals and along quaysides, but in ploughed fields and quiet backwaters where hemp bundles soaked in retting pools. The plant itself played along. It flourished on modest soils and open ground. Farmers sowed it thick so stems would race upward, each plant competing for light, yielding long, straight fibers in the outer bark. Crops were taken when stalks matured, but before they turned fully woody, cut stems were tied and submerged in ponds or vats, retting to. Let microbes break down the pith and loosen the bast. Once lifted and dried, the stalks were broken on wooden brakes, scutched to knock away woody bits, then hackled through combs until fine strands lay ready for spinning. Technology remained simple well into the early modern era. What the system demanded was not machinery, but many hours of human effort. Women and children often handled the more delicate finishing steps. Ropes emerged from long rope walks, looms turned out canvas and coarse fabrics. Small workshops twisted cords for everything from fishermen's nets to the shrouds of ships of the line. Hemp seed, meanwhile, was pressed for lamp oil, lubricants, and varnishes. The plant was used almost to the last scrap. Because naval might hinged on it, governments used all manner of carrots and sticks to encourage hemp cultivation. Tax breaks, bounties, even compulsory planting. Privileges for growers could be framed as both economic development and national defense. Landlords might be required to allow tenants space for hemp. Magistrates could fine those who let land lie fallow when fiber was desperately needed. Colbert's France centralized production with an eye firmly on the royal fleet. In England, the Crown's dockyards constituted a dependable buyer, anchoring markets. The Dutch East India Company bargained hard but depended utterly on steady deliveries. Even where oversight was lax, simple prices did their work. Hemp values climbed with wartime demand, coaxing farmers on the margins to try their hand at the crop. Supply chains stretched from scattered farms through storage barns, along roads thick with carts, onto riverboats headed for towns and ports. Contracts for cordage were drawn up years in advance of a ship's launch. Rigging could be budgeted in so many tons of hemp, tar, and labor. Admiralties stockpiled fibers. British naval depots held yarns and finished rope, while royal yards hired specialist rope makers and caulkers to keep ships seaworthy year after year. Naval stores tar, pitch, hemp developed into a distinct economic sector whose seasonal cycles shaped employment, trade routes, and even urban growth. Whenever war came, the campaigns of Louis XIV, the Anglo-Dutch conflicts, the Napoleonic struggles, the price and availability of hemp could help decide policy. But nothing in technology stands still. 17th and 18th century innovations layered gradually atop this world. 19th century changes then rearranged whole industries, leaving hemp less central to day-to-day industrial life, though still valuable in niches. The cotton gin, patented by Eli Whitney in 1793, was perhaps the single most transformative invention for fiber economies in the Atlantic world. It made upland cotton cheap and quick to process, and so brutally profitable on the slave-worked plantations of the American South. Spinning and weaving machinery, concentrated in places such as Lancashire, further favored cotton, whose fibers were smoother and more compatible with the new industrial looms. Hemp and flax, with their coarser texture and more laborious preparation, lost ground. Paper, too, turned away. Mid-19th century innovations in wood pulp processing, pioneered by figures like Friedrich Keller and Carl Daniel Ekman, pushed production away from rags and hemp scraps toward mechanically and chemically treated timber. Steam displaced sail. As iron hulls and coal-fired engines took over, the era when hemp rigging literally stitched the world's sea lanes together gave way to one where smoke and steel cable did most of the work. Wire rope and later steel chains replaced hemp in many heavy-duty uses. Where hemp persisted, it often did so in older fleets or in remote economies that had not yet adopted the newest materials. Hemp's centrality in imperial logistics shrank steadily, though traces of its importance lingered. Its other roles as remedy and intoxicant would continue along different trajectories, passed from hand to hand in very different settings. While hemp stalks held ships together and its fibers cradled merchants' cargo, the plant's mind-altering side traveled by other routes, embedded in certain regions and transformed in others. Across medieval Islamic lands and broader Eurasia, the psychoactive forms of cannabis resins and preparations called hashish, charas, or bhang became entangled with religion, healing, and law in ways that reveal much about culture and connection. The surviving sources mix the tones of astonished travelers, inquisitive doctors, wary jurists, and playful poets. Ibn Sina Avicenna, who lived from 980 to 1037, and whose canon of medicine, long guided scholarly medicine, knew of the plant and noted its actions. As a drug, it could sedate or dull pain. As a poison, it could cloud thought and fragment memory. Al-Birun, his contemporary in the 11th century, journeyed to India and documented local customs and substances in a proto-ethnographic style, describing bhang and other preparations with care. Ibn al-Baitar, the 12th–13th century Andalusian botanist who worked in Damascus and compiled his great compendium of simples in the 1240s, listed cannabis among 1,000 other remedies. In all of these writings, cannabis straddles two roles: a therapeutic commodity and an object that provokes professional curiosity. Trade bound those medical descriptions to larger movements. Overland routes linked Central Asia's steppes and cities, Bukhara, Samarkand, Merv-to-Persian courts, and the caliphal centers of Baghdad. From the Hindu Kush and upland Afghan valleys came dense hand-rubbed resin, kharas, traveling over mountain passes into caravan metropolises. From India came bhang, dried leaves and flowers worked into pastes and drinks already rooted in seasonal festivals. From the Maghreb, in later centuries, came mixtures of resin and tobacco smoked together. These products flowed along the same arteries as spices, textiles, and doctrines, carried by merchants and pilgrims. Concepts of intoxication were far from uniform. Islamic jurisprudence was clear regarding wine and khamr drinks that intoxicate and induce heedlessness. Cannabis forced jurists to confront an awkward categorization problem. Was it essentially the same as wine and thus prohibited in all forms? Or was it a different matter because it was an herb rather than a fermented grape product? And because its effects varied, legal opinions multiplied. Some jurists took a hard line, equating cannabis with wine and condemning it entirely, while others carved out narrow exceptions for medical necessity. The influential medieval scholar Ibn Taymiyyah, 1263–1328, thundered against hashish and other intoxicants, arguing that any substance producing intoxication should be treated as wine in law. His writings shaped later orthodox attitudes, yet actual legal practices on the ground ranged widely. In some districts, Sufi practitioners whose mystical teachings valued ecstasy and rapture experimented with cannabis as one vehicle among many toward experiences they described as union or annihilation in God. Persian Sufi verse from poets like Rumi, 1207–1273, and Hafiz, c. 1315–1390, turned intoxication most often with wine into metaphor for mystical abandonment. Whether those metaphors always masked literal use of cannabis is debated. What is not in doubt is that certain orders and wandering dervishes at times used hashish in ritual or contemplative settings. The overall picture is one of ambivalence. Cannabis is simultaneously medicalized, spiritualized, feared, and regulated. The notorious label Europeans later heard, hash-shash, and added lurid color to this ambivalence. Crusaders and chroniclers applied the name to the Nizari Ismailis entrenched in mountain strongholds of northwestern Persia. Medieval Latin and later European sources claimed their leader, Hassani Sabah, c. 1050–1124, dosed young initiates with hashish to bind them into fanatical obedience. Modern scholarship, reading contemporary Muslim sources more closely, largely rejects this sensational story as hostile caricature, but acknowledges how powerfully it shaped the European imagination. Hashish became, in such tales, a symbol of dangerous Eastern fanaticism, rather than an ordinary plant derivative woven into everyday life. Reality across the region was far more mundane and diverse. In India, cannabis had deep roots stretching back to Vedic times. In Central Asia, nomadic groups munched seeds and used hemp oil in cooking and lighting. Doctors from Cairo to Herat filtered these inherited customs through humoral theory, prescribing cannabis extracts for pain, hemorrhoids, fevers, or the delirium of epidemic diseases. Local context mattered. In Central Asian trading centers, Bukhara, Samarkand, Herat cannabis was part of both the apothecary's chest and certain male leisure cultures. In Levantine and North African cities, its use rose and fell with political climate. The Mamluk rulers of Cairo, a military caste wary of disorder, periodically cracked down on public hashish consumption during the 14th and 15th centuries. Enforcement, however, tended to be sporadic and localized. Under the Ottomans, hashish reappeared in provincial edicts and legal debates, sometimes banned outright, sometimes loosely tolerated when tax revenue or pragmatism outweighed moral alarm. In the mountains and deserts of the Maghreb and the Atlas Range, distinct regional strains and practices developed. In Morocco especially, Kifa, term used both for the herb and the culture surrounding its use, grew into its own identity. As in many borderlands, the meaning of the plant emerged from negotiations between central authority and resilient local traditions. Literature preserves tones that formal rules often smooth over. Persian poets filled their lines with warnings, jokes, and bemused commentary on intoxication. Arabic writers, too, recorded moral tales and humorous sketches about those who lost their senses to various substances. Ibn Battuta, traveling through India, the Levant, and North Africa in the 14th century, observed bhang in South Asia and hashish in cities like Damascus and Cairo, reporting them as part of ordinary social life in some circles. The political map that emerges is a patchwork. In one town, magistrates pursue punishment. In another, doctors prescribe tinctures, and in a third, hashish drifts through coffee houses with little official concern. When European empires expanded across the globe, moving goods, people, and laws in ever greater quantities, hemp and cannabis were carried into new ecological niches and social configurations. Ships did not only bear ropes made of hemp, they brought seeds, farming techniques, and consumption habits. Spanish and Portuguese navigators of the 16th century transplanted hemp cultivation to the Americas, alongside wheat, grapes, and sugarcane. Manila galleons stitching the Pacific to the Atlantic needed cordage, and colonial administrators began comparing traditional fiber crops like abaca in the Philippines, confusingly dubbed Manila hemp by Europeans, though botanically unrelated to true hemp in cost and performance. In the British colonies of North America, hemp arrived early. By the 17th century, it was woven into colonial agriculture as an everyday crop for rope and coarse textiles. Settlers in Virginia, Maryland, New England, and elsewhere tested varieties and processing methods. Hemp's reputation as resilient and versatile meant it often appeared in rotation on mixed farms. Labor regimes shaped how it was grown. In the Caribbean, with sugar as the reigning cash crop, hemp seldom dominated, but where sacks and ropes were needed, estates cultivated fiber, generally with enslaved African labor. Jamaica and Cuba saw hemp fields standing beside cane, worked by men and women whose bondage underwrote imperial wealth. In British North America, enslaved people, indentured servants, and small freeholders all took part in hemp production. In the Australian penal colonies, early 19th century officials experimented with hemp fields, assigning convicts to grow and process fiber for ropes and sails, so that distant settlements could reduce dependence on shipments from Britain. It was a brutally practical calculus. Ports required cordage. Colonies that could supply it enjoyed strategic value. Empire also accelerated cultural mingling. Migrant communities carried both industrial knowledge and psychoactive traditions. 19th century flows of indentured Indian laborers to Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, Mauritius, and beyond brought ganja and bhang practices into new settings. Over time, cannabis slipped into local rituals and emerging identities in the Caribbean and parts of Africa, blending with African and European influences. Chinese migrants brought opium habits to many ports. African-descended populations adapted their own herbal practices to new landscapes, incorporating cannabis where it was available. Colonial cultures, as a result, became unexpectedly hybrid. Medical practice followed the imperial pattern. William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, an Irish physician in the British East India Company's service in Calcutta, published influential observations in 1839 that introduced many European and American colleagues to cannabis's pharmacological promise. He documented its use in India for tetanus, rheumatism, and convulsions, and argued for controlled trials within Western hospitals. His case reports, relayed in sober Victorian prose, sparked genuine scientific interest and helped bring cannabis extracts into formal pharmacopoeias. At the same time, more bohemian currents formed. Paris in the 1840s hosted the Club des Hachishans, where writers like Théophile Gautier and Charles Baudelaire, among others, experimented with hashish at the invitation of psychiatrist Jacques-Joseph Moreau. Their meetings blurred clinical curiosity with romantic exoticism. The Oriental resin became fodder for essays and prose poems about artificial paradises, and the word hashish slipped into European languages, carrying both fascination and suspicion. Imperial governments responded unevenly. British administrators in India, confronted with widespread cannabis use across castes and regions, ordered a massive inquiry, the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission of 1893-94. Investigators fanned out across the subcontinent, interviewing farmers, users, healers, and officials. Their multi-volume report, to the consternation of missionaries and moral crusaders, concluded that moderate customary use did not produce the catastrophic social harm some had claimed. It distinguished carefully between bhang, primarily ingested, ganja, smoked herb, and charas, concentrated resin, and emphasized that context poverty, alcohol abuse, hard labor, often mattered more to harm than the plant itself. Regulation, taxation, and licensing were recommended over outright bans. Elsewhere, colonial states leaned harder into control. French officials in North Africa and other administrators, seeing cannabis intertwined with leisure in colonized communities they already mistrusted, drafted laws to restrict or criminalize keef smoking, often under the banner of discipline and civilization. Meanwhile, the global shuffling of seeds and expertise remade landscapes. Hemp varieties crossed oceans, adapted and hybridized. Botanical gardens in capital cities catalogued strains, while farmers, indigenous and settler alike, continued selective breeding driven by fiber quality, seed yield, or resin content, depending on local diets and demand. In Brazil and the Caribbean, enslaved Africans and their descendants used cannabis medicinally and recreationally in ways shaped by African, European, and Native American influences. In the emerging United States, hemp appeared in household plots and larger fields. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson both cultivated hemp on their estates at Mount Vernon and Monticello. Their surviving notes mention experimenting with sowing times and processing methods, evaluating fiber quality, and lamenting the labor needed to break and dress stalks. For them, hemp was primarily a practical asset to be measured in yields and costs, fitted into broader economic schemes for plantation self-sufficiency and trade. Still, industrial capitalism and shifting imperial strategies ensured that cannabis and hemp would not follow a single straightforward path. As ports thrummed with steam and steel, and as new drugs entered pharmacies in glass vials, cannabis's psychoactive products became increasingly urban phenomena, something shared by sailors, soldiers, migrants, and bohemians in taverns and back rooms. Hashish, charas, bhang, and mixtures thereof circulated in ways that could alarm colonial magistrates and delight romantic writers. The plant's doubled identity, once a staple fiber, now also a mind-bending substance, meant that in the imperial age, its history split into two interwoven tracks. One ran through dockyards, rope walks, and warehouses. The other through dispensaries, Sufi lodges, coffee houses, and side streets. Industrial needs and cultural uses coexisted and sometimes collided, leaving traces in bureaucratic ledgers and in songs, criminal codes and folk remedies alike. Hemp's gradual fall from its central place in imperial fiber networks was not abrupt. It persisted where climate, tradition, or economics still favored it, and surged back temporarily in moments of crisis, especially during 20th century wars when navies needed alternate fibers. Cannabis's other identity, as medicine, sacrament, and vice, became ever more tangled with nationalist projects, racial ideologies, and imperial fears as the 19th century shaded into the 20th. But between medieval hashish circles and colonial hemp fields, the plant had already played contradictory parts across continents, providing rope strong enough to anchor a flagship and smoke potent enough to loosen the mind's tightest knots. Merchants, officers, judges, and poets alike were compelled to make room for it, sometimes by drafting elaborate laws, sometimes simply by tending quiet gardens behind walls. By the 19th century, in the plain, methodical prose of naturalists, hemp was moving from folk knowledge into the ledgers of science. With that transition, its uses were named, measured, and contested, then poured into glass bottles with prescribed labels. Linnaeus had set Cannabis sativa firmly in print in 1753 as the familiar tall fiber plant. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, working with specimens from overseas in 1785, had christened stockier, more resinous plants from India as Cannabis indica. Those simple taxonomic gestures reflected the century's general confidence. To sort, to catalogue, to exert control through naming. But taxonomy also performed another subtle function. It codified cannabis in a Latin that physicians, pharmacists, and academics shared, translating farmers' lore about ganja or bhang into a language more easily slotted into medical texts and dispensary shelves. The vocabulary of the apothecary changed alongside. Vernacular practices, farm remedies, ritual concoctions passed through the sieve of botanical description and emerged as entries to be extracted, titrated, distilled, and, if policymakers deemed it necessary, regulated. The bridge between colonial praxis and metropolitan medicine was built in the 1830s and 1840s by doctors who had trained in Europe but practiced in India. William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, the same Irish physician mentioned earlier, stands out. Educated in Edinburgh and posted to East India Company hospitals in Calcutta, he combined the habits of clinician, engineer, and experimental chemist. He observed that local preparations of Indian hemp were used not just recreationally, but in cases of spasm, chronic pain, stiffness from rheumatism, and even the convulsions of tetanus and cholera. Publishing his findings to a Victorian medical audience hungry for effective remedies, he presented case after case in which patients unhelped by opiates or older treatments responded to cannabis extracts and tinctures derived from the plant's resinous parts. He described extraction techniques, suggested dosages, and urged Western colleagues to add these preparations to their armamentarium, especially in neurology and obstetrics. For a profession eager to combine novelty with evidence, his work provided both invitation and roadmap. Across the Channel in France and within Parisian literary circles, cannabis traveled a different path. The Club des Hachiciens, where figures like Gautier and Gérard de Nerval gathered, turned hashish into both experiment and symbol. Psychiatrist Jacques-Joseph Moreau published clinical observations on hashish's psychological effects in 1845, combining methodical case description with romantic fascination. Baudelaire's essays on artificial paradises translated those psychological notes into haunting images for the broader public. Hashish lodged itself in the European imagination as at once scientific curiosity, exotic indulgence, and potential pathology. In the quieter realm of pharmacies, cannabis acquired a respectable domestic face. Behind gleaming jars and brass scales, Victorian chemists sold cannabis tinctures, labeled in Latin and recommended for nerves, menstrual discomfort, persistent coughs, or general pain. By mid-century, these preparations appeared in official formularies. Pharmacopoeias in Britain and the United States listed extractum cannabis indicae, fluid extracts, and tinctures supplied by firms such as Park, Davis and Company. The US Pharmacopoeia included cannabis entries. Doctors could write prescriptions that any trained pharmacist would recognize. Commerce and science reinforced one another. To be useful, an extract had to be consistent. Manufacturers promised standardized potency, while physicians expected reproducible effects. By the late 19th century, cannabis was touted sometimes extravagantly as an analgesic that might moderate severe pain without plunging patients into the stupor caused by morphine, as an antispasmodic for tetanus and other convulsive disorders, as an appetite stimulant for those wasting from chronic illness, as a possible ally against certain headaches and neuralgias. Midwives and surgeons tried it as an aid in childbirth or in dampening uterine cramps. Asylum doctors, confronting melancholia and mania with few effective tools, dabbled cautiously. But the era's primitive chemistry posed problems. Plant chemotypes differed widely, extraction methods were crude, alcohol-based tinctures masked subtleties, toxicology was rudimentary. A dose that soothed one patient might unsettle another. Case reports read like miniature dramas, pages of astute observation coupled with unease about purity and measure. Outside the doctor's office, patent medicine manufacturers folded cannabis into mass-market tonics, sold under fanciful names. These syrups and elixirs promising relief for female troubles, rheumatism, catarrh, or nervous complaints, often combined cannabis with alcohol, opiates, and other active ingredients in formulations that would later horrify regulators. Mothers could unknowingly calm a crying child with a syrup containing morphine and cannabis. The growing medical profession, anxious to separate itself from quackery, eyed such remedies with suspicion, trying to draw a line between evidence-based use and carnival barker salesmanship. That tension played out in institutions and commissions. The Indian Hemp Drugs Commission, while primarily a colonial political instrument, also became a reference for later debates, demonstrating that sweeping moral claims were often unsupported by careful observation. Meanwhile, Victorian social reform movements sharpened their moral focus. The temperance movement, gaining strength through the mid to late 19th century, held alcohol up as a central plague of public life. As opiate addiction's costs became visible, morphine and laudanum joined alcohol in the demonology of reformers. Cannabis, arriving as an import associated with the East, inhabited a liminal moral space. It was not as visible a scourge as tavern drink, but neither was it as harmless in reformers' eyes as tea or coffee. Many doctors valued cannabis because it was not an opiate. Used judiciously, they argued, it might ease suffering without unleashing the same dependency. Many moralists, however, lumped it with other intoxicants, especially when it was linked in their imaginations with foreign populations, nightlife, and the working poor. Science furnished terminology and initial data. Moral rhetoric supplied urgency and direction. By the century's end, cannabis had become a standard, if somewhat controversial, item on hospital shelves, in pharmacy stockrooms, and in the booming patent medicine trade. Yet even as its clinical presence normalized, a quieter shift was underway. Laboratory pharmacology was falling in love with single-molecule drugs. Aspirin, crystallized in the 1890s as a pure, precisely dosed agent, became the emblem of this new paradigm. One compound, one known mechanism, one predictable effect. Cannabis, by contrast, remained a messy assemblage of plant material whose active components were still unidentified. That scientific uncertainty would shape the 20th century. It made cannabis harder to fit into the new chemical regulatory regime and provided ammunition both for advocates who argued its complexity was an asset and for opponents who used that same complexity to cast it as unknowable and thus unsafe. The 19th century had placed cannabis securely within Western medicine. The next decades would strip it out of pharmacopoeias and recast it as a problem for police and courts. As the 20th century opened, two overlapping regulatory projects took shape. One concerned the professionalization of medicine and pharmacy under new public health laws. The other involved the modern state's expanding capacity to monitor and police bodies, borders, and markets. In the United States, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 began to require accurate labeling and basic standards of purity. This new legal environment stripped away some of the patent medicine industry's more flamboyant claims and forced clearer distinctions between physician-prescribed drugs and over-the-counter nostrums. Doctors demanded standardized preparations. Pharmacists compiled formularies aligned with the law. In that world, cannabis became explicitly a drug, in statute something requiring regulation, prescription, and increasingly official suspicion. But laws on paper interacted with mass migration and changing social narratives in ways few policymakers foresaw. The Mexican Revolution of 1910 and subsequent unrest pushed large numbers of migrants north into the U.S. Southwest. They brought music, foodways, religious practices, and recreational and traditional uses of cannabis. In crowded border towns, where xenophobia already simmered, the presence of a foreign intoxicant became an easy focus for anxiety around race, labor, and order. Newspapers, hungry for sensation, translated marijuana into lurid copy. The Spanish word itself, marijuana, quickly entered English headlines in distorted spellings. Stories appeared linking this mysterious Mexican weed not just with intoxication, but with alleged outbreaks of violence, madness, and moral collapse. These anecdote-heavy pieces were rarely based on rigorous observation, but they functioned as stories that made sense to readers predisposed to fear poor immigrants and people of color. Local politics responded accordingly. Throughout the 1910s and 1920s, city councils and state legislatures in the Southwest and in scattered other jurisdictions introduced ordinances restricting or banning the sale and possession of marijuana. This was not yet a coordinated federal campaign. It was a piecemeal reaction, shaped by business interests, racial prejudice, and local headlines. Arrests were likewise local and often targeted at the newest and least politically powerful residents. In port cities like New Orleans and in growing centers like Los Angeles, police and reporters found it convenient to portray marijuana as a symbol of encroaching vice in Black, Mexican, and working-class neighborhoods. At the same time, cannabis seeped into new cultural scenes. In jazz clubs in Harlem, Chicago, and New Orleans, musicians and patrons used marijuana under a cloud of nicknames: Muggles, Tea, Reefer. Slang references appeared in songs. Louis Armstrong, among others, recorded pieces that alluded to the herb. For many in these communities, cannabis was one part of a broader creative and social environment. Long nights, improvisational music, and a sense of carving out space within an often hostile society. Moral entrepreneurs, however, recast that environment. In their telling, cannabis did not accompany creativity, it corrupted it. The drug became, in sermons and reform pamphlets, a tool that supposedly lured the young and respectable into jazz dens, interracial mixing, and delinquency. Race and culture were braided tightly into the drug's public image. Beyond the United States, similar processes unfolded in different legal and cultural idioms. Across the Caribbean, Latin America, and parts of Africa and Asia under colonial rule, cannabis appeared in police reports and administrative memoranda as one more substance to be watched. Imperial and national governments gradually extended drug control frameworks initially built for opium and cocaine to include cannabis. On the diplomatic stage, the 1925 Geneva Opium Convention, negotiated under the League of Nations, brought cannabis explicitly into the early architecture of international drug control. The convention did not criminalize domestic consumption, but it did urge states to restrict export and import of cannabis resin and related products, and to limit such trade to medicinal and scientific purposes. The language signaled a shift. Policymakers now spoke of the drug problem at the international level, and cannabis, previously peripheral to these discussions, was added to the list of substances requiring coordinated vigilance. Back in medical circles, early 20th century professionalization pushed many clinicians to distance themselves from cannabis. The rise of specialty hospitals and a rapidly expanding pharmaceutical industry delivering purified single-ingredient pills made plant extracts look old-fashioned and unreliable. New analgesics, sedatives, and hypnotics arrived with clearer dosing and more consistent results. Cannabis, chemically unresolved and increasingly controversial in law and media, began to seem risky professionally and legally. By the 1930s, these undercurrents were ready to coalesce into a national policy drive in the United States. The person who did most to crystallize that movement was Harry J. Anslinger, appointed in 1930 as the first commissioner of the newly formed Federal Bureau of Narcotics, FBN. The Bureau, created to enforce federal narcotics laws, needed a compelling mission and visible successes. Anslinger proved to be a gifted bureaucratic campaigner. He recognized that public fear and political capital could be generated by linking drugs to crime and moral panic. Through congressional testimony, press releases, and a steady stream of letters and clippings, he presented marijuana as a dire, spreading menace, especially among Black and Mexican communities and among the white youth who might mingle with them. His rhetoric leaned heavily on race and sensation. He compiled and circulated stories, some grounded in fact, many exaggerated or unverified, about individuals who, after smoking marijuana, supposedly committed murder, rape, or suicide. These narratives, stripped of context, played well in newspapers. William Randolph Hearst's media empire amplified them, combining existing xenophobia with the thrill of scandal. In popular culture, this moral panic produced artifacts of its own. The 1936 exploitation film, later immortalized as Reefer Madness, originally Tell Your Children, depicted clean-cut teenagers who, after trying marijuana once, spiraled into madness, crime, and death. The film is easy to mock now, but it reflected and reinforced a climate in which marijuana was increasingly framed as a uniquely destructive threat. That atmosphere set the stage for the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act. Congress did not outlaw cannabis outright under a straightforward criminal statute. Instead, following earlier models for regulating opiates, it imposed a complex tax and registration system. Anyone who grew, distributed, or possessed marijuana was supposed to register, pay special taxes, and handle government-issued order forms. On paper, it looked like tax policy. In practice, it functioned as a de facto ban. The law's requirements were so burdensome, and the penalties for mistakes so steep, that legitimate medical and industrial use became nearly impossible. Anslinger and FBN officials testified in favor of the act, presenting selective evidence and emphasizing lurid crimes over clinical data. Medical organizations were given little time to respond. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the act into law in August 1937, quietly inaugurating a new era in which cannabis commerce in the United States was, for all practical purposes, criminalized. Larger structural forces reinforced this shift. The Great Depression had heightened fears about disorder and undesirable populations. National prohibition of alcohol had recently been repealed, but its legacy, a powerful enforcement apparatus and a belief in the state's duty to regulate vice, remained. Targeting a less entrenched, less socially accepted substance like marijuana seemed politically safer than refighting the alcohol battle. The FBN, for its part, had an institutional incentive to broaden its jurisdiction. By treating marijuana as a major national threat, it could justify bigger budgets and staff. Law enforcement agencies benefited from the clarity of a new enemy and from public support for crackdowns. There were also economic rumors and half-formed theories. Some later commentators suggested that paper, textile, or petrochemical interests feared hemp as a competitor and quietly supported harsh regulation. Evidence for direct conspiracies is thin and mixed, but what is true is simpler. As new materials and technologies pushed hemp out of central markets, its defenders dwindled. When the Tax Act raised legal barriers, relatively few industrial actors were willing to fight for a crop already losing ground. The immediate consequences of the act were uneven but profound. Patients who had previously used cannabis tinctures now faced dwindling access. Doctors, wary of the FBN's power and of ambiguous legal risk, largely dropped it from their practice. Farmers who had grown hemp for fiber found themselves squeezed by both market changes and regulatory uncertainty. Some abandoned the crop, others saw their modest businesses wither. Communities whose cannabis use had long been normalized as part of Mexican, Caribbean, or African American cultures now found their practices thrust fully into illegality. police and prosecutors, armed with a new federal tool and empowered by local prejudice, enforced the law in ways that disproportionately targeted people of color. In court records and prison rolls, patterns emerged. Arrests for small-scale possession and use fell heavily on Black and Latino men. Meanwhile, the scientific study of cannabis in the United States nearly stalled. Researchers now had to navigate tax stamps, special permissions, and a thickening stigma to secure and use the plant in any formal study. What had once been an ordinary entry in pharmacopoeias became administratively toxic. The US shift rippled outward. American diplomats and officials, influential in League of Nations and later United Nations circles, promoted stricter cannabis control abroad as part of broader narcotics treaties. By the late 1930s and 1940s, many countries had tightened their own laws, often citing international obligations or following US example. Colonial administrations in Africa and Asia leaned on metropolitan prohibitions to justify local crackdowns, sometimes targeting traditional practices long tolerated or ignored. Not everyone agreed with the new orthodoxy. Some physicians continued to argue quietly for cannabis's therapeutic use. In certain countries where cannabis had deep cultural roots, medical and legal communities questioned whether blanket criminalization made sense. In 1939, New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia commissioned an independent study by the New York Academy of Medicine to investigate marijuana use in the city. The LaGuardia report, published in 1944, found no evidence that moderate marijuana use led to insanity, violent crime, or widespread addiction. It criticized sensationalist claims and recommended a more nuanced approach. Anslinger reacted furiously, denouncing the report and pressuring federal agencies to discredit it. The FBN's political clout ensured that the LaGuardia findings had little immediate impact on policy. But the episode revealed cracks in the narrative. Evidence could contradict fear, even if officials chose to ignore it. From the 1890s through the 1930s, cannabis's status had swung from promising medicine to controlled substance to near taboo. The arc was not inevitable. The Indian Hemp Drugs Commission had demonstrated an alternative. Regulation grounded in social context and empirical observation. But institutional incentives, racial politics, media dramatization, and the centralizing impulses of the modern state pushed policy toward prohibition. By the time World War II ended, cannabis in the United States and much of the industrialized world had become primarily a matter for criminal codes rather than pharmacopoeias. Yet the plant's chemistry remained only partially understood, and its deep cultural and therapeutic roles in other societies persisted beneath the surface of official narratives. The stage was set for the next set of reversals: a scientific re-examination, a countercultural embrace, and a punitive war that would help define late 20th century criminal justice. When the fluorescent lights flickered on over laboratory benches in the early 1960s, the work taking shape looked unremarkable to outsiders. Glassware, solvents, careful hands. It smelled of ether, chloroform, benzene, and the patients required to watch liquids separate and crystals slowly appear. Yet within that world of quiet repetition, a crucial untying began. Chemists had long suspected that cannabis's mind-altering effects came from one or more specific compounds among its many constituents. In 1964, Raphael Mechoulam and his colleague Yechiel Gaoni, working in Israel, published a paper that would become a milestone. They isolated, identified, and synthesized the principal psychoactive component of cannabis, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol THC. They were not beginning from nothing. Earlier pioneers like Roger Adams in the United States had isolated and characterized other cannabinoids, including cannabinol, CBN, and cannabidiol, CBD, in the 1940s. But Mechoulam's work provided a clear structural formula for THC and tied it explicitly to psychoactivity. Suddenly, the plant's effects could be traced to a distinct molecule, not just to vague oils or resins. The process itself was a modest epic of analytical chemistry, extracting complex mixtures from plant material, fractionating them, examining spectra, testing fractions in animals, and then confirming structures through synthesis. With THC in hand, pharmacologists could move from crude extracts to precise dose-response experiments. Concepts like receptor binding, agonism, and potency could now be applied to cannabis just as they were to other drugs. This chemical breakthrough arrived in a Cold War context where governments and industry were pouring money into biomedical research. Nausea from chemotherapy, appetite loss in chronic illness, spasticity, pain, and seizure disorders were pressing clinical problems in search of better treatments. THC offered a new lever for exploration. Synthetic analogues were developed, routes of administration were tested. One such derivative, dronabinol A synthetic form of THC, would eventually be approved as Marinol for treating chemotherapy-induced nausea and AIDS-related wasting. Here was botanical knowledge, translated into a standardized pharmaceutical product, stripped of plant variability and wrapped in modern regulatory structures. But even as the lab bench brought cannabis into sharper molecular focus, events outside the lab were radically reshaping its social image. In the 1960s, marijuana emerged as a visible symbol of youth rebellion in the United States and beyond. As civil rights campaigns, anti-war protests, and new countercultural movements converged, cannabis became one part of a broader rejection of authority and convention. In coffeehouses of Greenwich Village, along the streets of Haight-Ashbury, at rock concerts and communes, marijuana was smoked as an emblem of alternative values: peace, experimentation, community, distrust of official narratives. It mingled with new music, new sexual norms, and new political banners. For many young users, the substance itself was less important than the social and emotional spaces it opened. The federal government did not respond gently. Under President Richard Nixon, the war on drugs was officially declared. The Controlled Substances Act, CSA, of 1970 reorganized federal drug law into 5 schedules based on perceived medical value and abuse potential. Cannabis was placed in Schedule 1, the most restrictive category, reserved for substances with high potential for abuse, no currently accepted medical use, and a lack of accepted safety under medical supervision. This classification sat uneasily with emerging science and historical use. The same decade that saw THC's isolation and proof of specific reproducible effects also saw the federal government declare legally that cannabis had no accepted medical role. The tension between evidence and policy was stark from the beginning. Nixon convened the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, chaired by former Pennsylvania Governor Raymond Schaefer, to study the issue. The Schaefer Commission's 1972 report concluded that the harms of criminalizing simple possession far outweighed the harms of use, and recommended decriminalization for adult personal use. The report was thorough and cautious, but politically inconvenient. Nixon promptly rejected its recommendations. The CSA's classification remained unchanged. In the following decade, rather than softening, enforcement hardened. Under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, the war on drugs escalated dramatically. The Anti-Drug Abuse Acts of 1986 and 1988 enacted mandatory minimum sentences, expanded federal and state enforcement budgets, and promoted a zero-tolerance ethos. Drug policy shifted decisively from a mixed public health and control model toward a predominantly punitive criminal justice model. Institutionally, this war reshaped policing. The Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, created in 1973, grew in power. Local police departments received federal funds and surplus military equipment, encouraging more aggressive tactics. Asset forfeiture laws allowed departments to keep property seized in drug-related investigations, creating powerful financial incentives. SWAT teams and no-knock raids, once rare, became more common even for low-level drug warrants. Marijuana, widely used and easy to detect, became a prime driver of arrest statistics. Over the ensuing decades, hundreds of thousands of people, then millions, were cited or jailed for simple possession. Even when penalties involved probation or short jail terms, The resulting criminal records affected employment, housing, education, and civic participation. Enforcement patterns were sharply unequal. Surveys repeatedly showed that cannabis use rates among white, black, and Latino populations were broadly similar, yet arrest and incarceration rates for marijuana offenses fell disproportionately on black and Latino communities. Neighborhoods already struggling with underinvestment and over-policing bore the heaviest burdens of the drug war's cannabis chapter. Political rhetoric at times made the underlying calculations explicit. Years later, a Nixon aide would be quoted suggesting that the drug war had been used deliberately to discredit and disrupt political opponents, anti-war activists, and black communities. Whatever the mix of intentions, the policy outcomes, mass arrests in targeted neighborhoods, expanding carceral systems, and long-term social damage were clear. Resistance to this regime did not disappear, it evolved. Activist groups such as NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, founded in 1970, lobbied for decriminalization and legalization. A handful of states, beginning with Oregon in 1973, reduced penalties for possession, testing the waters of reform. These early legislative changes were limited, but signaled that federal orthodoxy was not universally accepted. Then, in the 1980s and early 1990s, a different moral force entered the debate: the AIDS epidemic. Patients with advanced HIV/AIDS suffered severe wasting, nausea, pain, and depression. Many found that cannabis smoked or eaten helped restore appetite, ease nausea, alleviate pain, and lift mood when standard medications failed or carried intolerable side effects. Caregivers and activists in cities like San Francisco bore witness. Mary Jane Rathbun, known as Brownie Mary, became a local icon, a grandmotherly figure who baked cannabis brownies for AIDS patients, risking arrest to bring some measure of comfort. Dennis Perron, a Vietnam veteran and gay rights activist, helped organize informal buyers clubs and lobbied for legal change. For this community, cannabis was not a symbol of youthful rebellion. It was a pragmatic, compassionate tool against suffering and early death. Their efforts culminated in California's Proposition 215, the Compassionate Use Act, passed by voters in 1996. Prop 215 allowed patients with certain conditions to use cannabis with a physician's recommendation and provided legal protections for caregivers who cultivated and supplied it. It did not create a fully elaborated regulatory system that would come later, but it cracked open a legal door that had been sealed for decades. The law also threw into sharp relief a deep contradiction in American federalism. Under federal law, cannabis remained a Schedule I substance. Under California law, certain uses were now lawful. This legal dissonance would shape the next 20 years of policy, creating both opportunities and vulnerabilities for patients, providers, and entrepreneurs. Test cases followed. The federal government raided medical cannabis dispensaries even when they complied with state law, arguing that federal prohibition trumped state permissions. In United States v. Oakland Cannabis Buyers Cooperative, 2001, the Supreme Court rejected a medical necessity defense to federal marijuana charges. In Gonzalez v. Reich, 2005, the court held that Congress's power under the Commerce Clause extended to banning even homegrown cannabis intended purely for personal medical use in states where it was legal, because such activity could affect interstate markets. These decisions did not invalidate state medical marijuana laws, but they underscored federal supremacy. Patients could be technically legal under state law and still vulnerable under federal law. Dispensaries, many born from activist buyers clubs, evolved into quasi-businesses navigating an unstable legal and economic terrain. They needed secure supply chains, storage, security, and rudimentary compliance systems, yet they operated without access to normal banking or clear federal guidance. States, improvising, began to build regulatory frameworks. They created patient registries, ID systems, and licensing categories: cultivator, processor, dispensary, caregiver. Rules varied widely, from loose to strict. In many places, the initial emphasis was on compassionate access rather than on pharmaceutical-level standardization. Product quality was inconsistent. Testing regimes were often rudimentary or absent. For patients, this meant that cannabis could be both a godsend and a gamble. Federal policy oscillated. During the Obama administration, memoranda from the Department of Justice, the 2009 Ogden Memo and the 2013 Cole Memo, advised prosecutors to deprioritize cases against individuals and businesses following state medical marijuana laws, provided certain enforcement priorities, such as preventing diversion to minors and cross-border trafficking, were respected. This was not legalization, it was a discretionary truce. Many interpreted it as de facto permission to build state legal medical markets. But memos are not statutes. They can be and were reversed. In 2018, Attorney General Jeff Sessions rescinded the Cole Memo, restoring broader latitude for federal enforcement, even as Congress continued annually to pass budget riders prohibiting the Department of Justice from spending funds to interfere with state medical marijuana programs. The result was an uneasy, evolving patchwork of toleration and latent threat. While law zigzagged, science pressed ahead. Following the isolation of THC, researchers suspected that such a specific molecule must act on a dedicated biological target. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, binding studies revealed high-affinity cannabinoid receptors in the brain and immune system. The first to be cloned and characterized, now known as CB1, is abundant in brain regions involved in movement, basal ganglia, memory, hippocampus, and coordination, cerebellum, but notably sparse in brainstem centers that regulate breathing. One reason cannabis overdose is less likely to be lethal than opiate overdose. A second receptor, CB2, turned up primarily in immune cells and peripheral tissues. These discoveries reframed cannabis pharmacology. THC was no longer simply a somewhat mysterious exogenous intoxicant. It was a key for locks the body already possessed. The next step was to find the body's own keys. In 1992, researchers isolated the first endogenous cannabinoid receptor ligand in pig brain and named it anandamide, from the Sanskrit ananda, meaning bliss. A second major endogenous ligand, 2-arachidonyl glycerol, 2-AG, was identified a few years later. These endocannabinoids are synthesized on demand in cell membranes, rather than stored in vesicles like classic neurotransmitters. They travel backward across synapses, retrograde signaling, to bind presynaptic CB1 receptors and modulate neurotransmitter release. Through this system, the brain fine-tunes excitability, pain signaling, appetite, mood, and responses to stress and inflammation. The endocannabinoid system emerged as a central regulator of homeostasis. This surge in basic science generated both optimism and warning signs. On one hand, it suggested new therapeutic avenues. Drugs that could gently enhance or dampen endocannabinoid signaling might relieve pain, reduce spasticity, protect neurons, or treat mood disorders. On the other hand, the system's ubiquity meant that crude interference could have far-reaching, unintended consequences. One candidate drug, rimonabant, a CB1 receptor inverse agonist developed in the early 2000s as an anti-obesity and smoking cessation aid, initially showed promise in reducing appetite and improving some metabolic markers. But psychiatric side effects, depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts forced its withdrawal from the European market before it ever reached US approval. The cautionary lesson was blunt. Manipulators of the endocannabinoid system must tread lightly. Meanwhile, state-level medical marijuana programs multiplied. Following California, states across the US adopted their own models via voter initiatives or legislation. Some programs were tightly limited, allowing only low THC, high CBD preparations for a narrow list of conditions. Others embraced broader lists and home cultivation. Regulators faced novel tasks. They had to decide who qualified as a patient, how much cannabis could be possessed or grown, how dispensaries should be licensed and inspected, and how products should be labeled and tested. Many early systems lacked comprehensive testing for potency, pesticides, heavy metals, or mold. Packaging rules were uneven. Without standardized dosing, clinicians struggled to advise patients beyond rough trial and error. Civil society groups tried to fill the gaps. Organizations like the Marijuana Policy Project and Americans for Safe Access provided legal support, lobbied for sensible regulations, and pushed for lab testing and patient protections. Activists found themselves evolving into entrepreneurs, and community collectives metamorphosed into licensed dispensaries. Commercial instincts mixed with patient advocacy in ways that sometimes created tension. Critics charged that medical frameworks were being used as Trojan horses for broader commercialization. Defenders insisted that market mechanisms were necessary to sustain access and innovation. Scientific evidence on medical efficacy accumulated, though imperfectly. Randomized controlled trials, constrained by Schedule I restrictions and limited access to standardized plant material, nonetheless supplied data points. Synthetic THC, dronabinol, and its analog nabilone showed clear benefit for chemotherapy-induced nausea and weight loss. Nabiximols, Sativex, a standardized plant extract spray containing roughly equal THC and CBD, demonstrated efficacy for some patients with multiple sclerosis-related spasticity. For chronic pain, especially neuropathic pain, meta-analyses suggested modest benefits for some individuals, but with wide variability and often small effect sizes. For many other claimed indications, from anxiety to inflammatory bowel disease, evidence remained preliminary or conflicted. At the same time, observational studies and clinical reports highlighted adverse effects: cognitive impairment, dizziness, dependence in a subset of users, and potential exacerbation of psychosis in vulnerable individuals, especially with heavy adolescent use of high THC products. Federal illegality in the US further complicated research. Until recently, scientists were generally limited to cannabis supplied by a single federally approved grow facility, often criticized for providing material unrepresentative of the diverse, potent products available in real-world markets. Multi-agency approval processes slowed studies. Internationally, strict scheduling under UN conventions and domestic laws also restricted large-scale trials in many countries. By the early 2010s, however, cultural attitudes in North America and parts of Europe had shifted enough that two US states, Colorado and Washington, moved from medical frameworks to full adult use legalization in 2012. This leap forced regulators into new territory, designing not just patient access systems, but complete commercial markets with retail stores, advertising rules, tax structures, and public safety campaigns. Questions multiplied. How should products be packaged to minimize child appeal and accidental ingestion? Should edibles be allowed, and if so, at what potency per serving? What constitutes cannabis-impaired driving, and how should it be tested? How can legal markets outcompete existing illicit suppliers without triggering aggressive marketing or overconsumption? Answers varied. Some jurisdictions set strict potency caps for edibles and mandated plain packaging with health warnings. Others allowed higher potency concentrates but imposed higher taxes on them. All wrestled with the delicate balance between raising revenue and keeping prices low enough to draw users out of illegal markets. Across these developments, cannabis's identity fractured and multiplied. It was at once a Schedule I drug under federal law, a plant with an endogenous receptor system and promising, if narrow, therapeutic niches, a symbol of subculture and rebellion, a commodity in burgeoning legal markets, and a focal point for debates about racial justice and criminal legal reform. In each arena, laboratory, courtroom, clinic, legislature, the plant meant something slightly different, and the rules governing it reflected that multiplicity. Beyond national borders, a more slowly moving but powerful structure had been taking shape: the international drug control regime. It grew out of early 20th century conferences, colonial concerns, and medical lobbying. and gradually wrapped cannabis into its paperwork. The League of Nations provided the first substantial framework. At Geneva in 1925, delegates debated hashish and Indian hemp. Egypt, citing moral and social harms, argued for strict prohibition. British India, managing a vast and diverse colonial population with long-standing cannabis practices, urged caution and flexibility. The resulting compromise did not ban the plant outright. Instead, it called on states to restrict export and import of cannabis resin and preparations to medical and scientific uses, and to keep careful records of international trade. This delicate balancing act, the preference for partial controls over open conflict, set the tone. When the League gave way to the United Nations after World War II, its scattered drug conventions were consolidated into a single instrument, the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. Signed in New York against the backdrop of post-war optimism about multilateral governance, the Single Convention aimed to streamline diverse treaties and codify the principle that certain substances should be limited to medical and scientific purposes worldwide. The treaty introduced a system of schedules, legal shelves, where substances were placed according to judged risk and medical use. Cannabis and cannabis resin landed on the most restrictive shelves. Schedule I, and more severely, Schedule IV, a subset indicating particularly dangerous drugs with limited or no therapeutic value, like heroin. This placement reflected the scientific uncertainty and political caution of the era, as well as prevailing attitudes shaped by US-led prohibition. Institutionally, the Single Convention created guardians: the International Narcotics Control Board, INCB, and the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. These bodies were tasked with monitoring national compliance, analyzing production and trade data, approving or questioning export quotas, and nudging states toward tighter control. Their influence was mostly moral and diplomatic. They could not directly coerce sovereign governments, but they could issue critical reports and apply international pressure. Subsequent agreements thickened the web. The 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances extended control to synthetic and naturally occurring psychoactive compounds not covered in 1961. The 1988 Convention Against Illicit Traffic added obligations around money laundering, precursor chemicals, and international cooperation in enforcement, emphasizing criminal law and interdiction. By century's end, cannabis was firmly embedded in this dense network. The architecture assumed a binary world. Substances were either legitimate tools for medicine and science, strictly channeled, or they were illicit, to be suppressed. For decades, that model went largely unchallenged in official diplomacy. But facts on the ground began to diverge. Scientific work on cannabinoids and the endocannabinoid system undermined the claim that cannabis had no therapeutic potential. Patient movements, as in California, brought compassionate use into public view. Some countries adopted tolerant or pragmatic policies. Dutch coffee shop decriminalization from the mid-1970s, Portugal's decriminalization of all drugs in 2001, Canada's medical access regulations in 1999, pushing against the spirit, if not always the letter, of the treaties. The first open legislative breach came from a small South American nation. In 2013, under President José Mujica, Uruguay enacted a law creating a state-regulated system for cannabis production and sale for adult residents. Home growing, cannabis clubs, and pharmacy sales were legalized under strict oversight. Uruguay did not formally withdraw from or rewrite the Single Convention. Instead, it argued that its framework still fulfilled the treaty's ultimate aims: protecting health and reducing illicit trafficking by channeling demand into a controlled legal system. Canada's 2018 Cannabis Act went further in symbolic weight. As a G7 country long committed to multilateral treaties, its decision to legalize and regulate adult-use cannabis nationally created an undeniable tension with the plain text of 1961. Canadian officials acknowledged discrepancies but emphasized public health rationales: better control of youth access, quality assurance, and displacement of criminal markets. In the United States, federal law remained unchanged, but a growing number of states adopted medical and later adult use legalization. The result was a legal mosaic, a federal Schedule I designation alongside state-licensed dispensaries and retail stores. The INCB repeatedly reminded governments of their treaty obligations, using language that mixed bureaucratic concern with thinly veiled disapproval. But in practice, there was no appetite among major powers to punish non-compliance. The regime's rigidity met the realities of national democracy and evolving science, and it bent rather than broke. Multilateral institutions slowly adapted. The World Health Organization's Expert Committee on Drug Dependence undertook a formal critical review of cannabis and related substances beginning in the late 2010s. The committee sifted through clinical and epidemiological data, weighing evidence of therapeutic uses and risks. Its recommendations, issued after lengthy deliberation, proposed removing cannabis and resin from Schedule 4 of the Single Convention while retaining them in Schedule 1, effectively acknowledging that earlier categorizations had been too harsh and failed to reflect emerging science. In December 2020, the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs voted narrowly but decisively to adopt that recommendation. Cannabis and resin were taken off Schedule I4, though they remained controlled. Nothing in this vote legalized cannabis internationally, but symbolically it marked a realignment. The international system publicly conceded that cannabis did possess recognized medical value and that its most stigmatizing classification was out of step with evidence. The broader treaties remained intact. Countries that legalized adult use continued to occupy a gray zone, technically out of step with some treaty provisions, but not facing serious diplomatic sanctions. The 2016 UN General Assembly Special Session, UNGAS, on drugs had already emphasized health, human rights, and development, giving reform-oriented states rhetorical cover to argue for more flexible interpretations. In that gradually loosening framework, a modern cannabis industry began to coalesce. It grew cautious green shoots in medical markets, experimental Dutch coffee shops, and state-level US systems, then surged when national and subnational legalization provided stable legal ground. Uruguay's experiment was modest and domestically oriented. Its small size limited global economic effects. Canada's 2018 move, by contrast, turned cannabis into a mainstream investment topic. Once a wealthy country with robust institutions and a national regulator legitimated a legal cannabis market, global capital took notice. Publicly traded companies sprang up or rapidly scaled in Canada, where federal legality allowed them to list on major exchanges. Firms like Canopy Growth, Aurora Cannabis, Tilray, and Kronos Group raised substantial funds on the Toronto and Nasdaq markets. They promised investors exposure to what commentators named the Green Rush, the anticipated global expansion of legal cannabis. Alcohol giants such as Constellation Brands and tobacco firms like Altria took strategic stakes, hedging against future shifts in consumer preferences. Yet the global trade picture was more complex than rosy projections suggested. International treaties and domestic laws limited cross-border movement of recreational cannabis. Medical cannabis, however, could be exported and imported under tightly regulated prescription-based frameworks. Some countries, such as Canada, the Netherlands, and later Colombia and certain African states, positioned themselves as exporters of medical-grade cannabis flower or extracts to markets in Europe and elsewhere. Domestically, models for retail and supply varied. In Canada, some provinces opted for government-run retail monopolies, while others allowed private stores under provincial rules. In the US, where federal law remained prohibitive, each legal state designed its own combination of licensing, vertical integration rules, and caps. Certain states barred companies from owning more than one link in the chain, cultivation, processing, sale, to prevent monopolies. Others permitted or encouraged vertically integrated seed-to-sale operators. Large multi-state operators, MSOs, emerged in the US, consolidating licenses across states into corporate portfolios. Names like Curaleaf, Trulieve, Cresco Labs, and Green Thumb Industries built networks of cultivation sites and dispensaries, betting that eventual federal reform would reward early scale. Products diversified. Consumers increasingly expected options beyond traditional dried flower. Producers responded with edibles, gummies, chocolates, baked goods, beverages, tinctures, sublingual strips, vape cartridges, topicals, and high-potency concentrates such as shatter, wax, and live resin. Branding efforts mirrored other consumer packaged goods. Sleek logos, targeted marketing narratives, lifestyle imagery. Regulators intervened to curb the most aggressive branding, especially where packaging could appeal to children or trivialize risks. Some jurisdictions imposed plain packaging rules or banned certain kinds of advertising. Public health officials, wary of repeating the marketing excesses of the tobacco and alcohol industries, argued for strong constraints. Firms, seeking differentiation and market share, pushed back in legislatures and courts. Financial dynamics were volatile. In the late 2010s, cannabis equity values climbed on speculative enthusiasm, then fell sharply as reality set in. Slower than expected retail rollout in Canada, burdensome regulations, stubborn illegal markets continuing to undercut prices, and profitability challenges in highly taxed, tightly regulated environments. Consolidation followed as weaker companies folded or were acquired. Parallel to THC-focused sectors, a separate boom developed around hemp-derived CBD after the 2018 U.S. Farm Bill defined hemp as cannabis with less than 0.3% THC and removed it from the Controlled Substances Act. This law opened national markets for industrial hemp and its derivatives, especially CBD in oils, capsules, foods, and cosmetics. Yet the regulatory environment for CBD remained murky. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, responsible for overseeing food and drug safety, maintained that CBD could not be added to foods or marketed with therapeutic claims without formal approval, since it had been authorized as a drug, Epidiolex. Enforcement against CBD products, however, was sporadic, leading to a sprawling, inconsistent marketplace with variable quality and sometimes misleading labels. Across all legal cannabis sectors, regulatory systems grew increasingly elaborate. Seed-to-sale tracking software, mandated in many jurisdictions, monitored product from cultivation to retail sale. Licensed labs tested products for THC and CBD content, pesticides, heavy metals, microbial contamination, and residual solvents. Labels displayed potency and serving sizes. Child-resistant packaging became standard. Excise taxes were levied by weight, potency, or price, depending on jurisdiction, in addition to standard sales taxes. Taxation became a delicate policy lever. If taxes were set too high, legal products remained more expensive than illicit alternatives, leaving black markets thriving. Set too low, and governments risked underfunding enforcement, prevention, and social equity programs, and potentially encouraging higher overall consumption. Striking a sustainable balance proved difficult, and some jurisdictions iteratively adjusted rates in response to market behavior. Banking remained a thorn in the U.S. Because cannabis was still illegal under federal law, most large banks refused to serve cannabis businesses for fear of money laundering charges and regulatory penalties. Many operators were forced into cash-heavy practices, increasing security risks and complicating accounting and tax compliance. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, issued guidance in 2014 describing how banks could work with cannabis companies under strict reporting protocols. But only a minority of smaller institutions chose to do so. Congress periodically considered, but did not pass, the Safe Banking Act, which would have given banks clear legal protections when working with state legal cannabis businesses. The resulting financial bottleneck disproportionately harmed smaller operators without access to private capital or complex legal counsel. These structural issues intersected with a deeper moral question: who should benefit from legalization? For decades, enforcement had fallen heavily on Black, Latino, and indigenous communities. As legal markets grew, many feared that well-capitalized, often white-owned firms would capture most of the profits, while those previously criminalized were left behind or locked out. In response, social equity provisions emerged in state and local laws. Illinois' 2019 Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act notably sought to tie licensing opportunities and tax revenue to equity goals, creating priority application categories for individuals from communities disproportionately harmed by drug enforcement and allocating funds for reinvestment in those neighborhoods. California's Proposition 64, legalizing adult-use cannabis in 2016, included measures for resentencing and record expungement, and cities like Oakland and Los Angeles launched local equity licensing programs aimed at supporting entrepreneurs with prior cannabis convictions or residents in heavily policed areas. However, turning aspirational equity language into real opportunity proved complex. Application processes often required substantial legal, financial, and technical documentation barriers for applicants with limited capital and experience. While some jurisdictions provided grants, fee waivers, or incubator partnerships, results were mixed. In many markets, large, well-financed firms still dominated, while relatively few equity applicants managed to open and sustain businesses. The industry's trajectory thus collided with patterns familiar from tobacco and alcohol: corporate consolidation, targeted marketing, and a risk of exploiting vulnerable communities as future customer bases. Public health experts and social justice advocates warned that legalization without strong, equity-centered regulation could simply exchange one set of harms, criminalization, for another: commercial exploitation and health burdens. Alongside economic and social questions, the health evidence continued to evolve, unevenly but steadily. Clear therapeutic uses gained recognition. Synthetic THC, dronabinol, and nabilone for chemotherapy-induced nausea and AIDS-related anorexia. Nabiximols for some patients with multiple sclerosis-related spasticity. Purified CBD, Epidiolex, for rare severe childhood epilepsies such as Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. Other indications: chronic neuropathic pain, certain forms of anxiety, PTSD, sleep disorders, had suggestive but not definitive evidence. Studies often suffered from small sample sizes, heterogeneous preparations, and short durations. High-quality, long-term randomized trials remained relatively scarce compared to those for many conventional medications. Risks, meanwhile, came into sharper relief. Epidemiological and clinical data supported associations between heavy, early-onset cannabis use and adverse cognitive and psychiatric outcomes in some individuals, particularly those with genetic or familial vulnerability to psychosis. Causality remained complex and contested, but enough correlation existed that public health authorities urged strict protections for adolescents. Cannabis use disorder, a pattern of compulsive use causing clinically significant distress or impairment, was recognized and diagnosable, affecting a minority but non-trivial share of users, especially among those consuming high-potency products daily. As legal markets widened access and increased average THC potency, health systems anticipated rising demand for treatment and prevention services. Driving impairment posed another challenge. Unlike alcohol, where blood alcohol content correlates reasonably with impairment, THC's pharmacokinetics are erratic. THC levels in blood or saliva do not neatly track real-time psychomotor function, especially in chronic users. Some jurisdictions adopted per se legal limits for blood THC. Others relied on behavioral field sobriety tests or combinations. None of these solutions fully satisfied scientists or legal scholars. Synthetic cannabinoids, laboratory-made compounds designed to act on the same receptors as THC, but often with far stronger and less predictable effects, emerged as a separate, alarming category. Marketed under names like Spice or K2, these substances caused severe poisoning, psychosis, and even death in some users. Legislators scrambled to ban specific molecules, But illicit chemists rapidly tweaked structures to stay ahead of the law. The synthetic cannabinoid crisis underscored how prohibition can generate dangerous substitutes and highlighted the potential protective value of regulated markets with known products and testing. The 2019 outbreak of e-cigarette or vaping-associated lung injury, EVALI, in the United States further illustrated the dangers of unregulated supply. Hundreds of serious lung injuries and several deaths were linked primarily to illicit THC vape cartridges adulterated with vitamin E acetate, used as a thickening agent. Legal, tested products were rarely implicated. Advocates of regulated markets pointed to EVALI as evidence that bringing production into the open, with mandatory testing and oversight, can reduce certain catastrophic harms. Against this backdrop of shifting science and market expansion, the politics of justice remained central. Policymakers and advocates increasingly framed cannabis reform not only as a public health and economic issue, but as a matter of repairing historical wrongs, expunging past convictions, releasing or resentencing those still incarcerated for cannabis offenses, and providing support for their re-entry into society became core elements of some legalization efforts. Progress varied widely. Some states automated expungements for minor cannabis offenses. Others required individuals to petition courts, a process many could not navigate. Even where records were cleared, residual harms lost years, disrupted careers, trauma could not be undone with a stroke of a judicial pen. Meaningful reparations required deeper investment in housing, education, employment, and community health in areas most burdened by past enforcement. Looking forward, the trajectory of cannabis policy appears as a set of branching pathways rather than a linear progression. One plausible future is a tightly regulated public health model, limited advertising, strict age controls, robust product testing, moderate taxation designed to undercut illegal supply while funding prevention and treatment, and strong social equity measures. Such systems would treat cannabis somewhat like a mix of alcohol and pharmaceuticals, acknowledging adult autonomy, but placing substantial guardrails around commercialization and youth access. A less favorable path is an unchecked commercial model. Aggressive branding, high-potency products heavily promoted, industry lobbying shaping regulations to favor profit over health, and equity initiatives reduced to token gestures. In this scenario, consumption and related harms might rise sharply, and the industry could mirror the worst patterns of tobacco or alcohol sectors in targeting vulnerable populations. On the international level, another fork involves treaty evolution. States could push openly for amendments to the Single Convention and related agreements, replacing prohibition-centric assumptions with frameworks that accommodate regulated adult-use markets and robust medical programs. Alternatively, the current pattern of quiet divergence national experimentation without formal treaty revision could persist, with international bodies gradually adjusting in practice while legal texts remain largely unchanged. Science will influence which paths are chosen, as better clinical trials clarify benefits and risks in specific conditions, and as long-term population studies mature, policymakers will have more precise tools. But evidence alone will not determine outcomes. Cultural attitudes toward intoxication, freedom, and responsibility, political priorities around crime, health, and markets, and the strength of social movements demanding justice will all shape the resulting laws. Legal reforms beyond cannabis, such as broader criminal justice reform, banking regulation changes, and workplace protections, will also interact with cannabis policy. A federal shift in the US, whether rescheduling, descheduling, or new statutory frameworks, would unlock conventional banking, reduce legal uncertainty for multi-state operators, and make large-scale multi-center research easier. It would also force a more explicit national conversation about equity, taxation, and federal versus state authority. Culturally, how societies talk about cannabis will matter. Narratives that center harm reduction, informed choice, and community well-being could support policies that minimize risks while respecting autonomy. Narratives that trivialize risks, or conversely reanimate prohibitionist fear, could skew decisions toward extremes. If you imagine a near future informed by current trends, you might picture city streets where medical cannabis clinics sit beside licensed dispensaries, community centers funded by cannabis tax revenue offering youth programs and job training, and quiet offices where judges sign orders expunging old possession convictions. In another corner of the same city, you might see corporate headquarters planning new product lines, rural farms shifting from illicit to regulated cultivation, and research labs testing cannabinoids as adjuncts for pain, mood, or neurodegenerative diseases. And still, in some neighborhoods, you would see old patterns persisting. Illicit dealers serving those locked out of legal markets, police patrols more present in some zip codes than others, and debates over where dispensaries should be allowed to open. The story of cannabis today is thus not simply a biography of a plant, but an ongoing experiment in governance. It forces societies to decide how to classify risk and benefit, how to weigh personal freedom against collective health, and how to remediate past injustices while shaping new markets. Whether we move toward a thoughtful equilibrium where regulation dampens harm, opportunity is shared, and science is nurtured, or toward an inequitable commercialization that repeats older mistakes, will depend on 1,000 pragmatic choices. How licenses are allocated, how taxes are set, how strictly advertising is policed, how seriously expungement and reparations are pursued. History will not only note what laws were passed, but for whom they worked and whom they left behind.